Our next guest is Margaret Commodore, a member of the Stolo Nation. In 1970s, Margaret was instrumental in the fight against injustice in Yukon, working tirelessly for the rights to right the wrongs that government had created. Margaret was originally member of the Yukon Indians Women's Association and became vice president of the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians, referred to as YANSI. As negotiations began, her voice grew stronger. She was respected and referred to as for her work and advocacy across the territory, and also her dedication would ultimately take her to the Legislative Assembly, where she played a pivotal role in the mid-80s. Margaret was elected for 4 consecutive terms, serving in the riding of Whitehorse North in 1982, 1985, 1989, and Whitehorse Centre from 1992 to 96, and she became a driving force under the Tony Pennicott NDP government of the day. Serving as a cabinet minister for 7 years, to become the first First Nations woman to ever be named to the cabinet in 1985, serving as Minister of Health. Woohoo! And that's what they do in Parliament, is bang the table. Serving as Minister of Health and Human Resources from 1985 to 1989, and then served as the first ever Aboriginal Minister of Justice in Canada from 1989 to 1992. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Margaret Commodore to the 50th anniversary for Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow speaker series. Woohoo! So, Margaret, I just want to welcome you and thank you very much for taking the time. It's so great to have you back home, if you will. And I use that term very lightly, if you will, because I just recently found out that you weren't even a Yukon First Nation citizen, but everybody referred to you as such. So for the ones that may not know you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and the journey that you're on?
Thank you, Grand Chief. I'd first like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the Kwanlin Dun and the Taan Kwachin. They're traditional lands, and I'm very honored to be here once again to be on your land and to enjoy what I'm enjoying now. I was born in Chilliwack a long time ago. I just had my 90th birthday in October.
Oh, my Lord.
I actually came up to the Yukon to celebrate it, and there were a lot of people there. My Champagne-Ajac friends, my NDP friends, my ball-playing friends, and I'm just getting kind of emotional. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah, anyhow, I'm from the Sawali band in the Stolo Nation, and my father was Andy Commodore. He married my mother, Teresa Prest, who was a non-status Indian, simply because my great-grandfather was from England. He didn't marry my grandmother, but he lived with a great-grandmother, but he lived with her for a number of years and had a whole bunch of children that they failed to register, which they could have at that time because she was a status Indian. And anyhow, my mother became a status Indian when she married my father, which was a good thing. I mean, it worked in her favor at that time. Mm-hmm. And we moved off the res when I was very young and moved over to where the work was for my father on Vancouver Island. And I went to public school for 1 year. And I think the Indian agent might have found out where my family lived, because the next year I found myself in residential school, a place where I spent 8 years. And it was a big change from, a mixture of everybody in the community to 8 years in residential school, and a lot of the people sitting here have been to residential school. They know the effects that it has on every single person that went there. And I came to the Yukon. A lot of people don't know this, but I was in the Yukon very early in the 50s, from 1954 to 1956, where I came up because I had a cousin that was here working, invited me to come to her wedding. I was going to go back to where I came from because I liked it there, but I was broke. So I had to get a job, and I worked in the Yukon for 2 years. I was 21 years old at that time, and that really was my immersion into the white society, because I was the only First Nations woman at a building that housed 1990 of us who worked for the Army or Air Force or whatever. And some of you might remember my return to the Yukon, but prior to that, I had left for 9 years, and while I was gone, those years I got married, lost my status, had a couple of kids. I needed an education, so I went to school to become a licensed practical nurse with no help from Indian Affairs. I couldn't access any of the benefits that they had. I couldn't access their housing. In some way, I was able to make that as a young single parent. And I went back to the hospital I was working at. They let me leave for a year. Anyhow, how I got back to the Yukon was I read an ad in the paper, and they were looking for a girls supervisor at Yukon Hall, preferably a practical nurse, which caused me to apply for that position. And so I came back then. I didn't do one single day of nursing, but I worked with all of the kids that were there, and a lot of them, of course, today are grandmothers. And that's where I first met Adeline Weber. She's been my friend ever since. But I really enjoyed the kids. What I didn't enjoy was the way they were treated. I mean, it was too much like residential school, which I had experienced for 8 years. And I think that Adeline told me that I was the first person who ever spoke up to the person who ran the school. And I complained about the working hours and the shift work and stuff like that to the union, if you could imagine. And then I started to complain to him because the kids were showing me their hands from getting strapped. And it would be black and blue right around their hands. And of course, nothing was done about that. And there was all these kinds of things that, they structured, they were not good, and for somebody like that to be in care of all of those kids should not have happened. And we had to work with him. I only worked there a year, but during that year, I was talking about it yesterday with James Allen, where I met Harry Allen and Harold Kane, and they were just young kids, and they used to come up to me every once in a while and start BSing about life in the woods and being hunters and scaring me and telling me how fierce the moose were in the Yukon, because I'd never seen a moose before I came here. And I really enjoyed the kids, I really did, but I had to leave that. And then shortly after that, I went to work at the hospital. I finally was doing a job that I was trained to do. And at the same time, I worked in the medical ward. I met some First Nations people while I was working there. And I recall one time there was, I think, some people from Haines Junction who were burnt, had burns caused from a fire. But what I remember about him is complaining about the white man's medicine. And I said to him, well, what would you use? And he said, well, I would use pitch. And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I guess pitch was very important to him and his healing. And at the same time, they trained me to work in the OR, where I would be on call every once in a while to come in for emergency operations as a scrub nurse and stuff like that. And my children were very young at the time, so I chose to leave for the summer, and I did. And when the summer was over, I wanted to go back to work because I like working. And John Hoyt asked me if I wanted to drive a kindergarten bus for Skookies, and I'd never done that before, and I had to take a driver's test to get a chauffeur's license. And what was so cool about that is I had to travel all over Whitehorse to pick up all these little kids and take them to Kishwood Hall, where they had the kindergarten. So I got to know a lot of people from Kishwood Hall at that time. I already knew some. I also know the little kids, and it was really quite interesting because every once in a while they tell me stories. You know, do you know what happened in my house last night? And then they tell me all these stories about things that were happening, some funny, some sad, but it was really interesting. And working at Skookies is how I got involved with First Nations people in the Yukon. I knew we had a problem. I knew there were so many injustices out there, and I got involved with all that was happening there. Like there was so much happening, and I spent a lot of time there doing a lot of volunteer work. And at that time, I was married to Bobby Joe, and we had a little girl, and they used to drop me off and pick me up, and it happened so often. And that one night when I got home, Sheila, just a little girl, she said, "You know what Daddy said last night?" And I said, "What?" He said, "She spent so much time there, she should marry them."
Oh.
But that was my life from then on, and there were so many things that were happening, and so many of us involved in a way that we wanted to change things, and a lot of people around who cared about the things that were happening within the Yukon. And the Y&B had already been established, and they were doing their work, and including non-status Indians at that time. And but there were still a lot of people that were left out that didn't have the family support that they had at that time. And we decided to sit down and talk about our, the non-status people who had no status, who were suffering, as Billy mentioned when he was sitting up there that day, and the situations that they were living in. No, they were not. They were not able to have a house to live in, so they lived everywhere else. So they could not take advantage of the health and education programs that were available to them. And so we started the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians, which was my first step into a political way of life, and to learn what it was we had to learn to make these changes, because there was no way that a lot of us wanted to see what was happening in our community, where people were missing out on something that should have been available to them through no fault of their own. I mean, it was the fault of an Indian Act that was so horrible that a lot of people could not live unless they had the things that were available to them. And in forming the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians, we all had to learn. I mean, the whole learning experience where we said, what do you want us to do? You know, the people out in the communities, we wanted to make contact with you. We wanted to find out what we could do to make things better. And we established locals out in the community and to organize the people in the community to try to learn what we were doing and how we could make things better. And that was a long process, and we traveled right around the country. We met with other groups, Métis non-status organizations across the country. We traveled to some of their annual assemblies. We were affiliated with the Native Council of Canada, and we met with them very often to find out the situations of the people across the country and how are we going to help them as a group that's been established to try to do something for you. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a whole lot of things available, but at that time, we started to meet with cabinet ministers. We started to meet with other groups who are already doing a lot more than we were. And throughout that process, we were learning how we could do things, how we could work with our people in the Yukon who are non-status to get on with their lives in a good way. And it was very hard. And when we organized a provisional executive George Asp was the first president. I worked with a lot of really good people and learned from them. And then there was Joe Jacko, who a lot of you people will remember was the second person that I worked with because I ran as vice president every single year and I won. So I got to work with all of these knowledgeable people who taught me a lot about the Yukon. And I also worked with Frank Chambers. He was elected. We had to be elected every year. I mean, every single year. So we had to behave ourselves all year. And then I'm not sure if Frank ran against Bill Weber or not. But anyhow, I ended up working with Bill for a number of years and was working with him when I finally left Yancey and moved on. The hardest part of being with the non-status Indians was trying to become a part of what was happening with the status Indians, with what was happening within the Yukon Native Brotherhood. And once we were organized, we, at the request of all of the people who were non-status Indians, let's work with our families. Our family want us to be a part of what is happening in the Yukon. We want you to be a part of, instead of separate programs where only we could take advantage of, we want to be able to be a part of what was entitled to us if we had our status. So we did start working with YNB. We were separate in a way, and it became very difficult once we were able to get funding, because there was a strict line there about what you could do as a non-status Indian. And the biggest part started, and I don't have a whole lot of time. I mean, I could talk forever, but I don't have a whole lot of time to talk. But the really important part of it was when the land claims started. And at the start of talks about land claims and where the Yukon was going, we were allowed to sit in with Elijah and the bands at meetings to talk about where land claims should go and what it was that we wanted. And we were welcomed. We were welcomed to be a part of them. But there was the thing in the background that was working against us. And I think it was a month before Elijah presented his Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, we had a meeting scheduled in Whitehorse, and the Yukon Indian Brotherhood invited us to attend because we were going to look to see what we wanted to put into the document. And we were happy. We invited delegates in from each local, as they did from their bands. And something horrible happened at that time. We were all there waiting, and the next morning to go in there, we weren't allowed to go. You know, and that was something that just happened out of the blue. We weren't allowed to attend. All of a sudden, there was something that fell into place that morning that said, no, we don't want them at our meeting. And they turned away people like Rosalie Washington and her husband, Margaret Workman and her husband, Doris McLean and her husband, and even Johnny Johns and his wife were not allowed to go in. And you know what that was? It was the Indian Act. It was the Indian Act that determined who they thought was an Indian. And that was very hard. It was very, very hard for us. We were sad. The brothers and sisters and aunts and grandmas sitting inside at the meeting were looking at us and shaking their heads and saying, why aren't you here? So wasn't as easy as people thought it would be. And we worked very hard to make that right. The people in the community, the families wanted to be together. And a month later, the paper, the gold booklet was that we have right now was presented in Ottawa, and that was a momentous occasion. I was very happy about all that had taken place. the chiefs traveled to Ottawa with Elijah and supporting people to present that paper. And it was such a thing that my heart was so full that it was going to start to make a difference for the rest of the people, but we were still sort of in the back because in doing the history of Yancey right now, we've sat around and we've talked about the history of Yancey because it's going to be put into a book, and all of us were thinking about some of the problems that occurred, and today, nobody knows that it took so much for that to happen. And even a month later, and I got another document that I remembered from when I was with Yancey, where they were questioned about land claims and who was involved. And still at that time, the non-status Indians were not a real part of it. The families were a part of it, but the Indian Act allowed that division. So we had to work very, very hard. The whole group of non-status Indians had to work very hard with the families, with the leaders of the Yukon Native Brotherhood to be a part of that, of the process that was taking place. And I was at a meeting, I can't remember how long later, after all of the discussions, after all of the working together, where YNB said, yes, you are part of us. You are a part of us. You belong to us. And that made me cry. The tears came down my face. And it was just, you fight so hard for something, and it happens. And the work that all of us did together made that happen. It could not have happened if Yancey hadn't started and started the fight for non-status Indians. But during that time, we were also working very closely with non-status Indians and the Yukon Indian Women's Association that I was also a part of. And that was a really big thing because at that time we were allowed, it didn't matter whether you were status or non-status, whether you lived from outside or wherever, that you could be a part of it. And that was another really big fight because there were so many of us that lost our status and we suffered. I lost my status for almost 30 years before I was able to take advantage of what was available. And I married Bobby Joe at that time, but he had also given up his status, so I didn't gain any when I married him. I should have asked him before we got married. But anyhow, the Yukon Indian Women's Association, we did a lot of things together, and we traveled to Ottawa to try to make a difference for people right across Canada. And in Ottawa, they had a very strong organization called Indian Rights for Indian Women, with people like Mary Tuax early and Jenny Margetson, who'd been working on this for a long, long time and trying to find out how we could get the government to change the Indian Act, to get rid of the discriminatory sections that took away our rights. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, we lost our rights, but if any of our men married a white woman, she gained her rights. She could even run for chief, which happened to one band in Chilliwack. And not my band, but it was another one. I wouldn't have let it happen, but that we were successful as well, and we worked very hard at that. We traveled to Ottawa to meet with these groups. The biggest meeting we ever had, and Adeline talked about it the other day when we sat down with the women at I think it was their annual assembly or something, and we spoke so loud and clear because by this time we were becoming educated, and we knew how to speak out, and we knew what we wanted. So the Yukon delegation was getting up and speaking like we were very good at what we did at that time, and we knew what we wanted. And as Adeline said, are you running for office? And they really thought we were running for office because we got up and spoke so much, but we spoke so much because we knew what we wanted. And that eventually paid off. But in the meantime, we did a lot of things, and I spoke about it last night. We looked at situations in the Yukon that were unequal. And a lot of you older people will remember how the government in the city of Whitehorse advertised in brochures that our graveyards were a tourist attraction. It was written in black and white. If you want to enjoy something, we have this attraction available. You can go up and visit all these graveyards with these houses and stuff like that. So there were buses that would pull up, and all of these people would get out and they'd wander throughout the graveyards. And that was horrible. There was no respect whatsoever. And I don't even believe, I wasn't here when it happened, but I don't even know if they went to Champagne or Najac and said, can we do this? Or Kwanglen, can we do this? Can we allow all these people to come in and do that? Anyhow, we were really mad about that. That was only one thing we were mad about. So we had a big demonstration down at the graveyard. And it started by the Indian Women's Association, and we invited the commissioner to come down. He said, after it was over, he told us he was scared. and we also invited YNB to come down with us because, and Yancey, who was still at that time. But anyhow, there was a lot of people down there, and they, even though it was still in their brochures that there was a tourist attraction, they quit doing it, and they quit doing it because of the women. And not only that, we wanted to let people know that it wasn't a tourist attraction, so we had signs made that said it was. I don't think they're still up anymore, but I know they were still there, letting people know it was not a tourist attraction, and to respect our burial grounds. And we even paid for the signs that we had made. Like, I don't even know where we got the money from, and I can't even remember who did the signs, but we paid for that. And there was like little things like that happened all the time, and slowly making progress and watching what was happening with YNB, and being a part of that as non-status Indians was very good, and we really enjoyed it. And I left there and moved on to being a Justice of the Peace. I took advantage of a Northern Careers program to do that, and I was trained for 6 months by Judge Barry Stewart to become a Justice of the Peace. And because I've always been interested in justice. One thing that I should remember, when I was at Yancey, there was a national conference for justice involving First Nations people, and it was a national meeting where we went to talk, because there was so much talk all over the country about how it was a big injustice, how our Indian people were treated, and we sat there for 3 days and talked about the situation right across Canada and how it could be improved and what could we do to prove that. And when I came back from that meeting, we struck the Indians in the Law Committee, which I was a part of, and I got very involved in meeting with the RCMP. Every time I'd hear a complaint, I would go directly to the head boss, and I would tell him about it every single time, and he tried to encourage me to talk to a sergeant or something, and I said no. But I moved on because I was interested in justice, and did that work for a while. And part of my training was spending time at the jail, not overnight, although they offered it, and spending a lot of time sitting on the bench with the judges at that time, and also driving around with the police. And I was really embarrassed the night that I did that, riding all over town, sitting in the front seat with a cop. And there were so many people out in the street that I knew. I can't remember the bar, but anyway, I drove down there, and this guy says, "Oh my God, there's Andy Nyman and Stanley Jack." And I don't think Andy would mind me telling this story because he's so open and cool. But anyhow, they picked them up and put them in the back seat. And one of the kids, I don't know whether it was Stanley or Andy, and they were looking at me really funny, and they said, "Margaret, why are you doing this?" Oh, my God. And by that time, I knew so many people. And another time when I was a Justice of the Peace, I was sitting on the bench. I sat on the bench every Thursday, and there was a door where everybody came in, like all of the people that came in to the people who were going before the courts and whatnot. And there was another door right beside the bench, and I'm sitting up on this bench and being really important and stuff like that. And they used to call us Your Worship, of all things. They called a judge Your Honor, but they called us Your Worship. But anyhow, I'm sitting there with my robe on and, being very official. And this guy walks by the door. He sees me and he says, "Oh, hi, Margaret." and of course, everybody in the court just killed themselves laughing. But anyhow, there was a lot of, funny stuff, but there was all very much a learning process. And it was at that time that I decided that I was going to do something else. And I'd heard about questions that were going to be asked in question period related to First Nations people. And I don't know if Billy was there or not, but I went down. There was a group of us that went down there, and the questions came up. I can't exactly remember what they were, but I was watching these people in question period, and I was thinking, God, I can do that. So I thought about it for quite a while while I was a Justice of the Peace, and in the end, in the end, that's what we did. I chose to run. I called the leader of our party, and I said, "I want to run." And he says, "Where do you want to run?" And I said, "Downtown," and which includes Quanlin Dun. And he says, "Well, I'm sorry, Margaret, but we already have somebody that's going to run there. Would you be interested in running at Kluane?" And I said, "No." I want to run in Whitehorse because I'd have the support of Quanlin Dun. And when they called an election, they allowed me to run, and I knew they would. And I felt, really bad for the person that they had chosen. He ran somewhere else, but
Did he win?
no.
No.
No, but I can't. When I was nominated, I started knocking on every single door in the riding and getting to know people. And by that time, I was known by a lot of people because of my ball playing days, with my Yancey days, with sitting on the bench and with being a nurse. So a lot of people knew me, but there was a lot of people out there, and I was running against Jeff Lattin. I think he was a local person, a cabinet minister, so I was hitting it pretty high. And of course I knocked at every single door at Quanlin Dun. But during the whole process of me going out and knocking on doors, I worked so hard that one night I was just working away, and people were coming to the door, and and the NHL players were on too, so I was getting a little bit of flack. and then one night, I stayed there so long because I was really getting into it, and I knocked at one door. This woman had a house coat on, and she knew me, and she said, "Margaret, do you know what time it is?" And I said, "No." Well, it was 11 o'clock at night, and here I'm still knocking on doors. and that's how enthusiastic I was. But a horrible thing happened during that time. And there were other First Nations people that were running at that same time. And one day a paper came out with a full-page ad that they named a whole bunch of people, including myself, don't vote for these people because they're too connected to the land claim process. They didn't want us to be elected because they felt that we would be a danger to all of the other people who were living in the territory. It was a horrible ad, and every single signature that was on there was from the Yukon Party, and I knew most of them. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the racism was so vivid. And I talked to Tony about it, and I said, what do you do? And we weren't quite sure what to do. But when I was interviewed by the Star, I told him what I thought. I told him it was out and out racism. And the headlines the next day was "Smacks of Racism," because that's what I said it was. But for people to use race like that and their hatred for land claims to try to stop something from being elected, I think it helped me. I really do, because there are good people out there. And in the end, I won, and I won with the help of Quanlin Dunn. I have always acknowledged that, because there were 4 polls in the downtown riding. There were 3 polls downtown where most of the white people lived, and then the Quanlin Dunn and the Marble area was in poll 4. I was three votes behind Jeff Lattin in the 3 polls downstairs, downtown. And once it hit Quanlin Dunn and the votes came in, I won. And thank you, Quanlin Dunn. I have always been grateful for what they did for me, and I've always had the deepest respect for what happened there, and at the same time, Dave Porter. Dave Porter. How could I forget him? Don't tell him. He and I were elected with 4 other New Democrats, so we ended up in the opposition, and we learned a lot from that. I had no idea what I was doing when I went in there, but it was a whole learning process about how to be an MLA and in the opposition. It's a good place, and before the 4 years was up, they called another election. This election was wonderful, and we had First Nations people running in a lot of ridings at that time. And we all worked. We really, really worked hard. And sitting there waiting for the results to come in, I think we had 7 people who had been elected from our party, and we were waiting for the results to come in from Old Crow, and I guess everything was shut down, and we got the word through a ham radio that Norma Cassie had won, and we jumped for joy because that allowed us to form the government. We formed a minority government with Dave and myself, Norma Cassie, Sam Johnson. We only had 4 at that time because, Roger but we did form the government with the help of the Liberals, and we were finally in government. And I can tell you right now that going from the opposition into government was a whole learning experience. And we were there with the help of I think there was 2 Liberals at that time. And it wasn't too much later when the liberal got into trouble with the law and was sent to jail, and it was unfortunate. I felt bad for him, but he did something that wasn't very pleasant. So we had a by-election, and Danny Joe ran, and everybody went there to go to Pelly to say, vote for Danny Joe, and Wilson Silverfox even wrote a song about voting for Danny Joe, and it was just cool, and everybody was playing it on their cassettes and their radios, and Danny Joe won. So the First Nations of the people were responsible for that government. We had 5 First Nations people in caucus with 4 others. So there's power out there. There's power out there if you work at it.
Yes.
It really is.
That's right.
And so that was a really, I mean, there was two Joes that were MLAs at the time, Danny and me, and every once in a while people would say, "Oh, are you guys married?" And we'd just kill ourselves laughing. And but anyhow, we ended up working very closely with CYI at that time and trying to put things in place that that would benefit First Nations people, because we had First Nations people in there that, including myself, that wouldn't let a government do certain things or ask them to do things that we needed done, and we the rest of the people really spent a lot of time talking to us. But I got to tell you one good thing that happened when we formed government. We appointed Sam Johnson as the Speaker of the House, your dad. And and we changed things. Sam changed things. He said, "I will be the Speaker, but I'm not going to wear that white man robe." And he didn't. I don't even know who made his robe, but it was a traditional robe that he wore into the house. And there was a certain prayer that you said once the house opened. He wrote his own prayer.
It's still being used today, actually.
And he had this robe, and he had his Indigenous prayer that affected everybody, and it was a sight to see. He followed this, what was it called? I can't remember. Anyhow, the guy that held that thing and walked in. Anyhow, Dave.
The sergeant at arms.
Yeah, the door would open. He would walk in with Sam right behind him, with his robe, looking really good, and the clerks behind him, and then we all had to stand up as Sam walked by us. I was so proud. And then he would sit down, or he would come in and stand there and do his traditional prayer, and then the house would be open, and we put up with that. I didn't put up, but that's what we lived with. That's what we lived with for 7 years. So we really got, and Norma kept us on top of things too, because she was pretty bossy, So there was a real good combination, and I really do believe that we changed a lot of things because of the First Nations people who were part of that government. I was very proud to be there, and I was proud to be, who I am, and proud that I had been included with the First Nations of the Yukon. Like Peter said, he didn't even know I wasn't born here. But we did do a lot of things, and I worked very, very closely with the RCMP at that time, because there were so many injustices, and I was so angry at things that were happening all the time. I remember getting involved in something that happened in Watson Lake when I was with Yancey, and a young kid, 17 years old, Dougie Johnson was his name, died at the hands of an RCMP. And a lot of people don't remember that, but he used to be in Watson Lake. He was transferred to Whitehorse, and he was down there visiting that weekend. And I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it was around the Belvedere Hotel, and these kids were standing up on the mound above that, and they start harassing the guy. And they were young. The kid was only 17, and he started yelling back at them. And he got so mad that he pulled Dougie Johnson down by the shirt, pulled him down, and turned him around and was yelling at him, and laid him against the garbage bin. And the kid at the time said that he choked him. Another kid said that he hit him, and he died. And they rushed him to the hospital, and and he wasn't alive anymore. And we made a lot of noise about that. Yancey did, and I'm sure YNB did too. And our voices were so loud that they actually ended up charging the cop. But of course, he was acquitted. Like Colton Boucher in Saskatchewan, and things that happen all over the place. But there were so many things like that were happening, and I have always been interested in justice. And I worked very closely with the RCMP in town here because I went to one of their cross-cultural education conferences, or 2 days of that. And I was the Minister of Justice at that time, and I asked if I could sit in on it, and they allowed me to. And that one single First Nations person was there to speak to all of the cops, to talk about cross-culture. And I mentioned that to Gilholm was his name at the time. And during the process of being the Minister of Justice, I set up an Aboriginal Justice Committee consisting of First Nations people who were an advisor committee to help us do our job. And one of the things that came up at that time is that the First Nations people of the Yukon from every single community should sit down for 2 or 3 days with a member of the RCMP from every single community, and that happened. It happened at Fort Selkirk, where you could only get there by air or by boat. And it lasted for 3 days. And Danny Joe was there, and so many other people that we knew, and they spent 3 days working together over the weekend, and the people there actually taught the cops at that time how to stick gamble. Yeah, and they were set up in tents and stuff like that. And things like that helped me a lot. It helped me a lot because there was an understanding at the top. We had the advisor committee. We had seconded an RCMP to work with us in the department. And Gina Nagano was a member of the force at that time who worked very closely with us. So there was a great deal of understanding there. And I don't know what happened, but it apparently went downhill after that. And it still wasn't good, but it was better. And I had one person, I think she was from Watson Lake, that came in to see me one day, and this is part of why I was wanting things to change. She had a whole bunch of racist papers that she brought in that the RCMP sent around to the different units, and they were discriminatory toward First Nations people, people who wore turbans, and they were ads done by them, and they had a place in Watson Lake they called the Wall of Shame, where they had all of these pictures. And I hadn't heard about that until after I visit there. And I told on them when I visit there, because I was also responsible for the Public Service Commission, where I told people they couldn't smoke in the building anymore. and when I got down there, the cop was smoking in his office, so I told on him. So there was there was a lot of changes that were taking place at that time, but I think the very fact that we had so many First Nations people in our caucus really helped all of us. I mean, even me, who wasn't born here, to learn so much about what it was that they wanted to do, and the kind of things that we did during that time to make changes. We developed a Child Strategy Act paper, and I was really concerned about how many children were being taken from their homes. And when I was a Justice of the Peace, I sat in on a closed meeting one time with Roger Kimmerly, and it was part of my experience. And I watched somebody from social services come in with a First Nations woman who was on the verge of losing her children. I couldn't believe it. I think she had 3 children, and this was her last appearance in court. and they were going to decide whether or not her children should be permanently taken away from her. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't even imagine something like that happening to me with my 3 children. And she was sitting there, and she was looking so scared and so sad. And Roger and I had a break, and we talked about it. And, what do we do? And that's what they did. Then they'd ask me my opinion about certain things that they were going to do, which was part of my training. And I said, they can't have her. They can't take her kids away. And they didn't. But that was only one occasion. Mm-hmm. But what surprised me is how often it happened and how easily it was done, where your children were taken out and put in foster care, where your children are taken there and adopted, and never to have your children around again. So my whole life in the Yukon mostly was spent trying to make change. I think working with the kind of people that I did helped that happen. I worked with really good people throughout the whole time that I was here, with Yancey, with YNB, with the Indian Women's Association, with other people in the community to try to change things. And when we were in government, I think the negotiations came to they had a final agreement while we were still in government, but the sad thing was that we were in the opposition when it was actually done, and that was really sad for me. But I just want to say that my start happened when I started with Yancey, when I got to know who Elijah was and what he was doing, and how hard the people of the Yukon worked to put that paper in place today for our children tomorrow. And to me, I can still see Elijah. I can still see him working. I can still see him teaching, not only status Indians, but everybody, including myself. Despite the problems that we had in trying to be a part of the Yukon Native Brotherhood and the families, it worked out. And here we are today, 50 years later. We're celebrating all of that hard work of the people from long ago.
Wow. What's more impressive than your resume is that you're 90 and you've just articulated for an hour a journey that most people can't even recall what happened, what they ate for dinner last night. So unfortunately, Margaret, we're out of time, and we have to now next Dave Joe as our next speaker because you've taken his time as well. So, all fairness, just want to thank you so much for coming home. And we didn't even get to talk about the pipeline blasters and my first recall about you throwing, 60-mile-an-hour fastballs across the plate here, and let alone that legacy. But I really hope that you can share your time and your stories with us over the next couple of days, as we only have a few short days left in this time, let alone a few short minutes left in this series. So,
just one more comment about the ball team. I carried my ideas wherever I went, so we were opposed to the Pipeline Blasters, and I was coaching the team, and that's what our team's name was, Pipeline Blasters.
Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Commodore.